The scorching Colorado sun beat down mercilessly as Blake Nolan spotted something unusual on the horizon, a crumpled form at the edge of the dusty trail leading to Ordway. The year was 1883, and at 28, Blake had seen his share of strange sights across the frontier, but the motionless figure sent a chill down his spine despite the summer heat. "Whoa, Thunder!" he commanded, reining in his stallion. Dust swirled around them as Blake squinted against the glare. What he had initially taken for discarded clothing was unmistakably a woman, lying dangerously still beside the road. Blake dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He approached cautiously, one hand hovering near his holster, a habit born of necessity in these untamed lands. But as he drew closer, he saw she posed no threat. Her face was flushed with fever, her dress stained with trail dust, and most striking of all, her swollen belly clearly visible beneath the fabric of her simple dress. "Madam, can you hear me?" Blake knelt beside her, noting how her eyelids fluttered at the sound of his voice. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with auburn hair spilling from beneath a once neat bonnet. When she didn't respond, he gently touched her forehead. It burned beneath his calloused fingers. "Lord Almighty," he muttered. Whoever she was, she needed help fast. The nearest doctor was in Ordway, a good hour's ride away, and she was in no condition to stay alone in this heat. The woman's eyes opened briefly, revealing irises the color of spring moss. "Help," she whispered, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Decision made. Blake gathered her carefully in his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. With practiced skill, he managed to mount Thunder while holding her secure against his chest. The horse snorted nervously at the unfamiliar burden. "Easy, boy," Blake soothed. "We are taking her home." His ranch lay closer than town, just 3 miles to the west. With the woman's breathing growing more labored by the minute, Blake urged Thunder into a gentle canter, mindful of the precious cargo he carried. The Double N Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a sturdy 2-story house, barn, and corral, standing defiant against the vast prairie. Blake had built it with his own hands after returning from the war, determined to create something permanent in a world that had shown him how quickly life could vanish. "Mrs. I. Holbrook!" he shouted as they approached the house. "Mrs. Holbrook!" The ranch's housekeeper emerged from the kitchen door, wiping her hands on her apron. Eleanor Holbrook had been with Blake since he'd established the ranch 6 years earlier, after his parents passed. At 55, she ran his household with military precision and maternal care. Her eyes widened at the sight of the unconscious woman. "Merciful heavens! What have you found now, Blake Nolan?" She collapsed beside the road to town. "She's with child and burning with fever," Blake explained as he carefully dismounted. "Ready the guest room." Mrs. Holbrook didn't waste time with questions, bustling inside to prepare. Blake carried the stranger through the front door, noting how her breathing seemed to catch with each step he took. Her face, though flushed with fever, was delicately featured, with high cheekbones and a determined chin. The guest bedroom was modest but comfortable, with a maple bed and handmade quilt that Mrs. Holbrook had insisted on to civilize the place. Blake laid the woman down gently while the housekeeper gathered cool water and clean cloths. "Should I ride for Doc Peters?" Blake asked, watching as Mrs. Holbrook expertly loosened the woman's collar and removed her shoes. "Not yet. Let's bring this fever down first." She placed a cool cloth on the woman's forehead. Poor thing's exhausted beyond measure, riding in her condition. Mrs. Holbrook clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "There was no sign of a horse or wagon," Blake said. "Looks like she was on foot." "In her state? Lord have mercy." The older woman shook her head. "Go fetch clean water from the well, the coolest you can draw, and bring my herb chest from the kitchen." Blake complied, glad to have something useful to do. As he pumped water in the yard, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? What desperate circumstances would drive a woman in her condition to travel alone in this unforgiving territory? When he returned, Mrs. Holbrook was gently sponging the woman's face and arms. She's stirring a bit. Might come around soon. As if on cue, the woman moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering open. Confusion clouded her gaze before panic set in. She tried to sit up, one hand protectively covering her belly. Easy now, Mrs. Holbrook soothed. You're safe here. Where am I? The woman's voice was hoarse but carried a refined quality that suggested education. Double N Ranch, about 3 miles west of Ordway, Blake answered from the doorway. I found you collapsed beside the road. The woman's eyes, indeed, a striking shade of green, focused on Blake. You carried me here? He nodded, suddenly self-conscious of his dusty appearance. Blake Nolan, madam. This is Mrs. Holbrook, who helps run my household. The woman hesitated before responding. Grace. Grace Edwards. Well, Miss Edwards? Mrs. She corrected quickly, though Blake couldn't help noticing there was no ring on her finger. Her hand unconsciously moved to cover the bare spot, as if she'd read his thoughts. Mrs. Edwards, he amended. You're welcome to stay until you're well enough to travel, though I reckon that won't be for a while, given your condition. Grace looked down at her swollen belly, her expression a complex mixture of pride and something darker, perhaps fear or shame. The baby is due within the month, she admitted. Mrs. Holbrook nodded knowingly. Then you'll be staying right here until after the birth, young lady. No arguments. Surprising both of them, Grace's eyes filled with tears. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. My husband, he's gone. Blake and Mrs. Holbrook exchanged glances. There was a story there, one that Grace Edwards wasn't ready to share. Rest now, Blake said firmly. Questions can wait. Over the next few days, Grace gradually regained her strength. The fever broke on the second night, and by the third day, she was able to sit up in bed and take meals with appetite. Blake kept his distance, riding out each morning to tend to his cattle and returning only at dusk, leaving her care to Mrs. Holbrook's capable hands. It was on the 5th evening when he returned to find Grace sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the lingering heat of the day. She looked different, her hair neatly braided, wearing a dress that must have belonged to Mrs. Holbrook in younger days, altered to accommodate her condition. Mr. Nolan, she acknowledged as he dismounted. I hope you don't mind. Mrs. Holbrook thought the fresh air might do me good. Blake removed his hat, suddenly aware of how wild he must appear after a day on the range. It's your health that matters, Mrs. Edwards. My porch is yours to enjoy. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long without properly thanking you. You saved my life, and my child's. Blake shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. Any decent man would have done the same. Perhaps, Grace said softly. But decency seems in short supply these days. The bitterness in her tone stirred Blake's curiosity. Mrs. Holbrook says you're healing well, he said, changing the subject. Though she's mighty concerned about you traveling in your condition. Grace's hand moved protectively over her belly. I won't be traveling until after the birth, she assured him. If you'll allow me to stay that long. This isn't a decision I'd ever consider otherwise, Blake said honestly. Having a woman in your condition here, without family, but the circumstances demand it. You're welcome here until you and your child can safely move on. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I promise I won't be a burden. I can help with cooking, mending. Mrs. Holbrook won't allow it, Blake interrupted with a smile. She's already warned me that you're to rest completely. She's quite determined on the matter. A ghost of a smile touched Grace's lips. She's been very kind. You both have. Something in her voice, a hint of surprise, as if kindness was unexpected, made Blake wonder again about her story. But he merely nodded, excused himself, and headed for the barn. Whatever troubles had brought Grace Edwards to collapse on that dusty road, they were her own to share when she was ready. As the days stretched into a week, then two, Grace became a quiet presence in the ranch house. Though still weak, she insisted on helping with small tasks, shelling peas on the porch, folding laundry, or reading aloud to Mrs. Holbrook while the older woman cooked. Blake found himself lingering over meals, drawn by the gentle cadence of Grace's voice as she shared stories from books she'd discovered on his shelves. "You have quite a collection," she remarked one evening as they finished supper. "I wouldn't have expected a cattle rancher to own so much Shakespeare." Blake felt a flush creep up his neck. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. Reading was important in our house." "It shows," Grace said simply. "Your mother must have been remarkable." "She was," Blake agreed. "She'd have liked you." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and an awkward silence fell. Grace looked down at her plate, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Mrs. Holbrook cleared her throat. "Blake, didn't you mention needing to check that fence line at first light tomorrow? Best turn in early." Blake gratefully seized the escape, bidding the women good night. As he left, he caught Grace watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. That night, a summer storm rolled across the prairie. Blake was awakened by a crash of thunder so violent it seemed to shake the house's very foundation. He lay listening to the rain lash against the windows when a different sound caught his attention, a soft cry from down the hall. Pulling on his trousers, Blake stepped into the darkened corridor. Another cry, definitely coming from Grace's room. Concerned, he knocked gently on her door. "Mrs. Edwards, are you all right?" When no answer came, only another muffled sound of distress, Blake cautiously opened the door. Grace was sitting upright in bed, arms wrapped around herself, trembling violently. "The storm," she whispered when she saw him. "I'm sorry. It's foolish." Blake entered the room, keeping a respectful distance. "Not foolish at all. Thunder like this would wake the dead." As if to prove his point, another deafening crack shook the house, causing Grace to flinch. In the blue-white flash of lightning that followed, Blake saw naked fear in her eyes, a terror that seemed deeper than mere discomfort with storms. "Would you like me to fetch Mrs. Holbrook?" he offered. Grace shook her head. "No, please. She needs her rest. I'll be fine, truly." But as another roll of thunder rumbled overhead, she closed her eyes, her breathing rapid and shallow. Acting on instinct, Blake crossed to the small table where a lamp stood and lit it, casting a warm glow across the room. "My mother used to say that storms can't hurt you if you can see the light," he said quietly. Grace opened her eyes, focusing on the flame. "That's a nice thought." "Would you like me to stay until the storm passes?" Blake offered, already moving toward the chair in the corner. "Just to keep the lamp lit." Gratitude flooded her features. "If you wouldn't mind." Blake sat down, deliberately keeping his gaze fixed on the window rather than on Grace in her nightclothes. "I used to be afraid of storms too," he said conversationally. "After the war especially. The thunder reminded me of artillery." Grace studied him in the lamplight. "You fought in the war between the states?" Blake nodded. "Union Army. I was young, barely 18 when I enlisted in '63. "You must have seen terrible things," Grace said softly. "Enough to know that most troubles we face aren't worth the worry we give them." Blake smiled faintly. "Though I still don't much like lightning." The storm continued to rage, but as they talked about books, about the ranch, about the town of Ordway with its single street and determined settlers, Blake noticed that Grace no longer flinched at each thunderclap. By the time the storm moved eastward, leaving only gentle rainfall in its wake, she was lying back against her pillows, her eyes heavy with sleep. Thank you, she murmured as Blake rose to leave. Not just for tonight, for everything. Get some rest, Mrs. Edwards, he replied gently, extinguishing the lamp. As he closed the door, Blake was struck by an unsettling realization. In the 3 years since establishing his ranch, this was the first time he'd felt something missing in his solitary existence. The following morning brought clear skies and a changed atmosphere in the household. Grace greeted Blake with shy gratitude when he came in for breakfast, and Mrs. Holbrook watched their interaction with knowing eyes. Blake escaped to his chores as quickly as politeness allowed, unsettled by the direction of his thoughts. He spent the day mending fences in the far pasture, welcoming the physical labor that left no room for contemplation. It was nearly dusk when he returned to find an unexpected sight. Sheriff Tom Miller's horse tethered outside the house. Blake entered to find the sheriff seated at his kitchen table, hat in hand, while Grace stood by the window, her back rigid with tension. Mrs. Holbrook hovered nearby, clearly distressed. Nolan, the sheriff acknowledged. Been looking for your guest here. Blake glanced at Grace, whose face had gone pale. What's this about, Tom? The sheriff sighed. Got a wire from Kansas City. Seems Mrs. Edwards here is wanted for questioning regarding the disappearance of her husband, Franklin Edwards. The room fell silent save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Blake looked at Grace, whose green eyes were wide with what looked like genuine fear. Disappearance? Blake repeated carefully. Mr. Edwards hasn't been seen in 3 months, Sheriff Miller explained. His business partner reported him missing 6 weeks ago when he failed to return from a trip. Mrs. Edwards left town shortly after, according to neighbors. That's not... Grace began, then stopped abruptly. Blake stepped forward. Sheriff, Mrs. Edwards is in a delicate condition. She's due to deliver any day now. Surely whatever questions need answering can wait until after the birth. The sheriff frowned. I have a duty. To protect all citizens, Blake interrupted firmly, including expectant mothers. I give you my word, she'll remain here at the ranch until she's well enough to travel to town and answer your questions properly. Sheriff Miller studied Blake for a long moment. You're vouching for her, then? I am. The certainty in Blake's voice surprised even himself. After a tense silence, the sheriff nodded. All right, Nolan. I trust your word. But I'll be back in 2 weeks to check on the situation. The authorities in Kansas City are mighty interested in speaking with Mrs. Edwards. After seeing the sheriff out, Blake returned to find Grace sitting at the table, her hands shaking. Mrs. Holbrook had wisely made herself scarce. I didn't kill him, Grace said immediately, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake sat across from her. I never thought you did. But I did leave, she admitted. I left because I had to. Blake waited, letting her find the words at her own pace. Franklin was not the man I believed I married, Grace continued, each word seeming to cost her effort. He was charming in public. Everyone thought him a successful businessman, generous and kind. But behind closed doors? She swallowed hard. He had a temper, and when he drank, which was often, it turned violent. Blake's hands clenched involuntarily on the tabletop. He hurt you. It wasn't a question, but Grace nodded anyway. When I told him I was expecting, he became worse, said it would ruin everything, that a child would tie him down. The night before he disappeared, her voice faltered. He threatened to get rid of the problem once and for all. I believed he meant to kill both of us. What happened to him? Blake asked quietly. I don't know, Grace said, meeting his eyes directly. Truly. He went out that night, as he often did. I was terrified he would return and make good on his threats, so I packed what I could carry and left on the morning train. I've been traveling west ever since, taking odd jobs where I could until I became too visible. She gestured to her swollen belly. And no one's heard from him since? Grace shook her head. He had enemies, gambling debts, business dealings that weren't entirely above board. Any number of people might have wanted him gone. Blake considered her story. Everything in his experience told him she was being truthful, yet he knew how appearances could deceive. "Why were you on foot when I found you?" A bitter smile crossed Grace's face. "I paid for passage on a wagon train to Denver, but when the leader discovered I was a woman traveling alone in my condition, no less he decided I would bring bad luck. Said no decent woman would be in my situation." Her voice hardened. "He left me in the last settlement we passed through, about 15 miles east of here. I used the last of my money for food and started walking." The unfairness of it ignited a slow, burning anger in Blake's chest. "The sheriff will be back," he said finally. "But you have my word. No one will take you anywhere until you and your child are ready." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything." "You could be," Blake agreed. "But I don't believe you are. And even if you were, that child you're carrying deserves a chance." Grace wiped at her tears with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will find a way to repay your kindness someday." Blake shook his head. "There are no debts between us, Mrs. Edwards." "Grace," she said softly. "Please, after everything, call me Grace." 3 days later, as a golden dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Grace's labor began. Mrs. Holbrook took charge immediately, sending Blake to fetch water and clean linens before banishing him from the house entirely. "Birthing is women's work," she declared firmly. "You'll only be in the way. Go see to your cattle and pray for a safe delivery." Blake spent the day in a state of distracted anxiety, unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. By mid-afternoon, he abandoned all pretense of work and paced the barnyard, jumping at every sound from the house. It was nearly sunset when Mrs. Holbrook appeared on the porch, tired but smiling. "You can come in now, Blake. She's been asking for you." His heart hammering, Blake entered the guest room to find Grace propped up against pillows, her hair damp with perspiration, but her face glowing with an inner light he'd never seen before. In her arms lay a tiny bundle, wrapped in one of Mrs. Holbrook's softest blankets. "Blake," Grace said, her voice weary but joyful. "Come meet my daughter." He approached cautiously, as if afraid his presence might somehow disturb the fragile peace of the scene. The infant was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and skin still flushed from the effort of being born. "She's perfect," he murmured, awed by the tiny fingers that curled reflexively around Grace's thumb. "I'm calling her Hope," Grace said, looking down at her daughter with undisguised adoration. "Because that's what she gave me when I had none left." Blake felt something shift inside him as he watched them, a certainty taking root where confusion had been. "It suits her," he said simply. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and quiet days as the household adjusted to its newest member. Blake found himself volunteering to walk with the fussy infant in the early morning hours, giving Grace a chance to rest. There was something profoundly moving about holding the tiny girl against his chest, watching the sunrise break over the prairie while her breathing steadied into sleep. Grace recovered her strength quickly, and with each passing day, Blake saw new sides to her determination when she insisted on resuming light household duties, gentle humor when she teased Mrs. Holbrook about her overprotectiveness, fierce love when she gazed at her daughter. The day Sheriff Miller was due to return, Blake found Grace on the porch swing, Hope sleeping in a basket beside her. She looked up as he approached, and he saw resignation in her eyes. "It's time, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Blake sat beside her on the swing. "The sheriff will have questions. But you don't have to face them alone." Grace's hands twisted in her lap. "What will happen to Hope if they take me away? If they believe I had something to do with Franklin's disappearance?" That won't happen, Blake said with more confidence than he felt. But if it did, I would ensure Hope was cared for. Grace turned to him, searching his face. Why? Why have you done all this for us? Blake had asked himself the same question countless times over the past weeks. The answer had come to him gradually, like the slow brightening of dawn. Because from the moment I found you on that road, something changed. As if I'd been waiting my whole life for that moment without knowing it. The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Grace's eyes widened slightly, and for a terrible moment, Blake thought he'd overstepped. Then she reached out, her fingers lightly touching his work-roughened hand. I felt it too, she whispered. Even in my fever, even in my fear. I knew I was safe with you. The confession seemed to release something in both of them. Blake carefully took her hand in his, marveling at how right it felt. Whatever happens today, I want you to know. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut him short. They both turned to see Sheriff Miller riding up to the house, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger. Blake squeezed Grace's hand once before standing. Stay here with Hope. Let me speak to them first. The sheriff dismounted, nodding to Blake. Nolan, this here is Mr. James Harrison from Kansas City, Franklin Edwards's business partner. The stranger, a portly man with shrewd eyes and an expensive suit, stepped forward. Mr. Nolan, I understand you've been harboring Mrs. Edwards. Something in the man's tone set Blake on edge. Mrs. Edwards has been recovering from childbirth under my roof, yes. May I speak with her? Harrison asked, his gaze moving to the porch where Grace sat frozen, one hand protectively on Hope's basket. You can say what you need to say right here, Blake replied, not moving from his position between the men and the porch. Harrison cleared his throat. Very well. Mrs. Edwards, I've come to inform you that your husband's body was discovered 3 days ago in the Missouri River. The authorities have ruled his death a homicide. Grace gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. However, Harrison continued, pulling a document from his coat pocket, evidence has come to light that clears you of any involvement. A man named Daniel Willoughby has confessed to the murder after being arrested for another crime. He claims Mr. Edwards owed him a substantial gambling debt and became violent when confronted. Sheriff Miller nodded gravely. The Kansas City authorities are satisfied that Mrs. Edwards had no part in her husband's death. They've closed the investigation. Relief washed over Grace's face, quickly followed by another emotion Blake couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly, but something more complex. There is another matter, Harrison said, unfolding the document. Mr. Edwards's will. It seems he had significant debts, Mrs. Edwards. The business is bankrupt, and creditors have seized most of your joint assets. I see, Grace said quietly. So I have nothing. Harrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. There is a small trust that was in your name alone. Not much, but enough perhaps to establish yourself somewhere new. I've brought the paperwork. As the men conducted their business, Blake stood to the side, his mind racing. Grace was free of suspicion, free of her husband, free to go wherever she pleased. The thought of her leaving created a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of reasoning could dispel. After Harrison and the sheriff departed, promising to send the trust money once the paperwork was processed, Grace remained on the porch swing, staring out at the horizon. Are you all right? Blake asked, joining her again. I should feel something more, shouldn't I? Grace said softly. Grief or anger or something. But all I feel is relief. Does that make me terrible? It makes you honest, Blake replied. No one could blame you for how you feel after what he put you through. Grace looked down at her sleeping daughter. Hope will never know her father now. Perhaps that's for the best, but someday she'll have questions I'm not sure how to answer. You'll find the words when the time comes, Blake assured her. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Grace Edwards. She smiled at that, though tears shimmered in her eyes. What happens now? Mr. Harrison said it would take a few weeks for the trust to be released. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already. Blake took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Stay. Grace blinked. What? Stay here. Not as my guest, but... Blake hesitated, then pushed forward. I know it's too soon. I know you're only just free of one life, and not ready to begin another. But I've come to care for you, Grace. For you, and for Hope. More than I thought possible. Grace's eyes widened. Blake. I'm not asking for promises, he hurried on. Just a chance. Stay here at the ranch. Let me court you properly, the way a man should. Give us time to see if what I feel, what I hope you might feel too, can grow into something lasting. Grace was silent for so long that Blake began to fear he'd misread everything. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached for his hand. When you found me on that road, I had given up, she said softly. I was certain Hope and I would die there, alone and forgotten. You didn't just save our lives, Blake. You gave me back my faith that good men exist in this world. She drew a shaky breath. I won't pretend I'm not afraid. The idea of trusting again, it terrifies me. But when I'm with you, I can imagine a future that isn't shadowed by fear. I can see Hope growing up here, running through these fields, learning to ride. A tear slipped down her cheek. I can see us building something together. Blake's heart soared at her words. Carefully, mindful of the sleeping infant between them, he lifted Grace's hand to his lips. Then stay, he whispered against her fingers. Stay, and let us build that future together. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Double N Ranch in pristine white by late November. The Christmas season brought with it a celebration unlike any the ranch had seen before. Not just the holiday, but a wedding, modest but joyful, held in the ranch house parlor with Reverend Wallace officiating and half the town of Ordway in attendance. Grace Edwards became Grace Nolan on Christmas Eve of 1883, with 5-month-old Hope cooing in Mrs. Holbrook's arms throughout the ceremony. Blake's gift to his bride was a formal adoption certificate for Hope, ensuring that in the eyes of the law, she would forever be a Nolan. She already was in my heart, he told Grace that night as they stood by their bedroom window, watching snow drift down in the moonlight. From the moment I first held her. Grace leaned back against her husband's chest, his arms encircling her waist. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken a different trail that day? If someone else had found us? Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. I believe some things are meant to be, no matter what path we take. You and Hope were always supposed to come into my life. And you into ours, Grace agreed, turning in his arms to face him. I never thought I could be this happy again. This is just the beginning, Blake promised. We have a lifetime ahead of us. As 1884 dawned across the Colorado prairie, the Double N Ranch flourished. Blake expanded his cattle operation with Grace's keen business sense guiding investments. Hope took her first steps in the spring, tottering across the porch with determination that made her parents laugh with delight. By summer, Grace's belly had begun to swell again, bringing fresh joy to their growing family. On crisp autumn evenings, neighbors passing the ranch might glimpse the family on the porch. Blake, with his arm around Grace, Hope on his knee, all watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of promise. Few would guess that their story began with a desperate woman collapsing on a dusty road, or that the love that now bound them had blossomed from the most unlikely of beginnings. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as misfortune, Grace often said in later years, when telling their grandchildren the story of how she and Blake found each other. And Blake, gray-haired but still strong, would always add with a wink. And sometimes they're just waiting for you on the road to Ordway, if you're paying proper attention.